Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to today's episode of the Daily Packers Post, where we bring you in-depth daily coverage of your Green Bay Packers. We have new videos dropping every day, Monday through Friday, so hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. It is my pleasure now to welcome our guest today, Jake Trowbridge. And Jake, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your expertise?
Yeah, Gil, thanks for having me on here. I'm Jake Trowbridge. I work with Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life. So I am very much in the weeds with fantasy football, especially this time of year, as we've finally gotten to see some real preseason action. So that's all heating up. But I do some writing for them over there. I focus a lot on long-term implications of fantasy football. So people who are in dynasty formats and things like that play beyond just 1 year, that's kind of my specialty. But I've been a Packers fan for longer than I think I care to admit, frankly, on this. But so I try not to overlap too much. I try not to let my green and gold colored glasses steer me too far in one direction for fantasy, but it definitely happened.
I could totally appreciate that. I always try to walk that line in my fantasy leagues as well. I guess let's start with the basics here. Jordan Love, let's start there. Where would you put him in the tiers of fantasy quarterbacks in a dynasty league?
Yeah, for the long term, Jordan Love, the Green Bay Packers told us what they think of him, obviously, giving him that massive contract. And so in Dynasty, for the long term, I always follow the money. I think that's the cleanest way to do it. You know, I'm not going to be a better scout than NFL scouts are. I'm not going to be a better coach than NFL coaches are. But what I can do is pull up those contracts and track the dollars that are going to these guys. And Jordan Love definitely has that. Now, from a fantasy perspective, certainly, we would like to see him have a little bit more scoot, right? A little bit more rushing upside. For real life NFL, I think he's a little undervalued as a quarterback. I really do. For fantasy purposes, I'd say he's probably adequately valued, maybe just slightly undervalued. In fact, I was just writing an article recently about guys that I thought, quarterbacks in the NFL that I thought this year going forward have a good chance at hitting that magic 35 passing touchdown mark. Because what I've found is if you can get a guy who does that, you know, if you hit that 35, it's almost impossible for them to be bad, from a real life perspective, unless you're throwing equal amounts of interceptions, of course. But from fantasy, it's very hard to not be a really good fantasy quarterback doing that. In fact, over the last decade, if you hit that mark, you were a top 12 guy, except for one guy. One time, Eli Manning in 2015 was the anomaly that proves the rule. But I do think Jordan Love, we have to look at him in his totality, which is how are they building around him for the future as well. And I know as Packers fans, certainly we look at what sometimes has been a frustrating wide receiving group, just simply because I think we all naturally crave a standout guy. We want a top dog in the offense, and we haven't necessarily had that since the days of, Davante Adams. However, they did, as I'm sure everybody well knows now, they, for the first time in a very long time, spent first-round draft capital on a receiver. They brought in Matthew Golden. So I think that the offseason moves speaks volumes to what they want Jordan Love to be, what they think that Jordan Love can be. And I believe that too. If you take away the injury last year, I think we're looking at a guy who hit or came close to hitting that 35 passing touchdown mark. Heck, he got pretty close in the games that he was playing. And I always like to contextualize stats just a little bit, Gil. So I looked at what happened when he came back in week 4 and then all the games that he actually played and finished. So we're throwing out that week 18 Bears game, thankfully. And if you do that, he was on a 17-game pace for 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns. So I would say, considering all the wide receiver injuries that he dealt with, that was pretty good.
The other factor with him last year, and you touched on it a little bit, that he didn't run much last year because he was hurt, most likely. I mean, he's never going to be one of the top 2 or 3 running quarterbacks in the NFL. But what do you think we can expect from him as a running quarterback this year? I would assume it would be better than what we saw a year ago.
I think it almost has to. And he can undersell what the effect of that MCL sprain was when he came back. And, you know, that's one of the things I love about Jordan Love is he doesn't go looking for the excuses. And that's admirable. But also, I think for our purposes, it's very helpful to say, hey, this guy had a real bad injury and came back probably faster than maybe arguably should have. And so, yes, I do think that that affected him. Mostly just his mobility, his ability to keep plays alive to do that. That's something that we didn't really see last year. You know, that's you could argue that he probably learned that from Aaron Rodgers of just escaping the pocket and keeping the play alive. That's what impacted him more than just saying, well, he didn't get 400, 500 rushing yards. Because as you said, that's just not his game. That's not who he is. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be. But you would like to see him be a little bit mobile. You'd also like to see his wide receivers help him out and not drop the ball as much. And hopefully that will correct itself as well.
Yeah, that's obviously, you know, the completion percentage, the yards, they go up if even half of those drops get cut, you know, reduced. But we'll see. Hopefully this year. I mean, the one thing you mentioned Matthew Golden, the one thing you got to love about him that scouts really love about him, he has really good hands.
Yeah, sticky hands is a great thing, especially as a rookie. I think often back, as probably a lot of Packer fans do, to that first throw from Aaron Rodgers to Christian Watson in the league, right? It's a big deep bomb. It was going to be a touchdown, and then oops, right through the hands. It's not just that it's shaking the confidence of the player, but it probably shakes a little bit of the confidence in the quarterback as well. You want to see that connection tight right away, and it does look like Matthew Golden's going to be that. I also just want to bring up with Golden, I wonder if people are underselling the versatility to his game because he's not just a one-for-one replacement for Christian Watson, I don't believe. You know, he brings more to the table and kind of a more well-rounded skill set. So I do think we have that guy potentially on the Packers that's really going to stand out.
And then comparatively, I mean, rookie wide receivers don't always dominate right away, even if 2-3 years. Look, Devontae Adams, Greg Jennings, a lot of Packer wide receivers, Jordy Nelson. It took 2 or 3 years until they really started to hit their stride. What do you project for Golden as a rookie, and how important and how good is he in a keeper league, in a dynasty league?
In Dynasty, I love the guy. And in all of my leagues, I've been higher probably than most. And I've tried not to let it be, you know, that I was sitting in Lambeau Field when his name was announced on the Jumbotron. I'm trying not to let that impact me again. But I really do think when you look at the long-term investment that they made, everybody's version of draft capital is just a little different. You know, I go to the Denver Broncos, and a guy like Sean Payton, the way that he invests draft capital is way different than a lot of other coaches, a lot of other GMs as well. I think the same can be said for the Packers. And again, going all the way back to 2002, the last time that they spent a first-round pick on a receiver, that's enough for me as long as he shows flashes and some consistency. Again, the sticky hands, that's a great start. Is he consistently getting open or open-ish enough for a guy like Jordan Love, who we know will still throw it in very tight windows? But if we see that, then I'm good. So if he gets, let's say, 600 yards this year, which I actually think is a very reasonable estimate, I see no reason to turn back from him.
Josh Jacobs had one of the better rushing seasons last year in Packers history. Can he do it again? And how valuable is he as a fantasy running back?
He's massive. You don't get a lot of true sort of workhorse running backs anymore these days. You look at Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley, Kyren Williams for the Rams, and it starts to thin out a little bit after that. You know, guys like Christian McCaffrey have almost kind of proven why you maybe don't want to do that as much, certainly as they get up there in age. And, you know, Josh Jacobs, not that he's old, but for a running back, he certainly racked up a lot of touches. And that's the thing that sometimes scares me, because it's rare to see a guy get 300 plus rushing attempts one year and be able to hold up and do that again the next year. From all the coach speak that's coming out, it seems like they still want to do that. They want to stick with him, and it might be by necessity. Marshawn Lloyd, unfortunately, dealing with a groin injury. I would love to see that guy just catch a break from the injury perspective, at least. Emmanuel Wilson, good, stable, but not an eye popper. You know, not somebody who's going to drag defenders often the way that Josh Jacobs does. So I think that we're looking at a decrease in touches for Josh Jacobs to try to keep him healthy. what does that look like? 30, 40 touches less, maybe. But I think you would have to hope, at least, with the reshuffled offensive line. And I know they didn't look good in preseason against the Jets, obviously, but you would hope that that improves his efficiency as they gel a little bit more too.
One thing that Jacobs really did well last year, he was a weapon in the red zone. I mean, it was either him or Tucker Kraft getting the ball in the red zone especially the second half of the season. Do you think he still is one of the primary red zone weapons that the Packers will look to this year?
I think you have to. I think at least for the way of keeping defenses honest. Jordan Love likes to throw the ball in the red zone. He's certainly open to doing that. Matt LaFleur encourages that, but you can't constantly do that. It can't all be Tucker Kraft. Maybe Matthew Golden gets a little bit more of that. Or again, if Christian Watson comes back halfway through the season, maybe he's able to work his way more in there. But it starts with Josh Jacobs. And I don't think that as the Packers have looked and tried to run the ball a lot more last year, that they're going to divert away from that this time.
Tucker Kraft, the number one receiver in the red zone last year, led the team in touchdown catches. Does he have another level that you think he could get to this year, or was last year going to be more or less where he's going to be?
What's tough to evaluate with Tucker Kraft is that he's still relatively new. He is. And tight ends, I think we maybe recently got pretty spoiled about some of these really studly tight ends coming out. You look what Brock Bowers did last year as a rookie. Year before that, it's Sam Laporta or whoever. And I think maybe we jumped the gun a little bit. Tucker Kraft is not there. He's not that level of a weapon just yet. But I think you could see him getting pretty close. I mean, he's one of the best tight ends in the league in terms of yards after the catch. He's been very consistent with that. Good hands as well. The thing that's probably going to have to fall off is, as we talked about with Josh Jacobs, he's not going to get all the touchdowns. It just can't sustain that way. And one of his biggest games last season, it really came with Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson out as well. It was week 5. He had 88 yards and 2 touchdowns. And that was kind of his, coming out party a little bit, at least for non-Packers fans, I think. I don't think that we should be expecting that. As it's not as crowded as a room, I think, as some people seem to think it is, but it's crowded enough that you're not going to see, an 800, 900 yard season from him, I don't believe.
Let's talk about the wide receiver position for the Packers, because there is no go-to guy yet. They're hoping Matthew Golden will eventually get to that role. But out of that crowded receiver room, who would you pick first if you were looking at that group other than Matthew Golden?
Yeah, he's the de facto number one, again, just because of the versatility I mentioned. Jaden Reed feels like the obvious number 2. What's a little tricky with him to project is, hey, how many 3 wide receiver sets are you going to be a part of? How many 2 wide receiver sets are you going to be a part of? And it gets me nervous to think about what his usage will be, because he looked very clearly like one of the best wide receivers on the field at all times last year, but he still didn't crest over 100 touches, despite the injuries to Doubs and to Christian Watson. So he is my number 2 on this offense, and I do think that he should be somewhat improved because some of the defensive attention will be off of him with Matthew Golden there. But I think maybe somebody we're sleeping on a little bit is Dontavian Wicks. And I've certainly had my ups and downs with Wicks here. I think all Packers fans have a little bit. We're not used to our guys dropping the ball that much in those key instances. So if he can clean that up, and it certainly is something that you can clean up, because Gil, I'm going to be the millionth person to say it, so get the balloon drop ready. But you know who else had trouble catching passes early in his career? Devontae Adams. And certainly that worked out fine for him. I think it's important that we comment on the corollary, though, because from a route running perspective, he's been constantly applauded. Matt LaFleur has come out and said he's one of the best route runners, certainly on that team. I would venture to say maybe one of the best in the league. So he's always getting open. ESPN has this open metric score that they use, and he was the 4th best receiver in the league last year at creating that separation from defenders. So if he can keep doing that, he'll get his chances. He's just got to clean up the drops.
Yeah, and look, he struggled with that a little bit in college, but it seemed to be he had a year where he struggled and then a year where he did really well, and it kind of alternated a little bit.
Yeah, it has to be consistent, obviously. And if you're Jordan Love, luckily he has a quarterback like Jordan Love that seems to be willing to keep trusting these guys. Maybe sometimes to the chagrin of the people on the sidelines there, but he's not somebody that's gonna. I think he's almost the antithesis of Aaron Rodgers in that way of, you fool me once, you fool me twice, I'm done with you kind of thing. Jordan Love does not do that. So you're right, though. It's going to need to be consistent for fantasy purposes. I look at Dontavian Wicks. He's not drafted. He's on nobody's draft board, basically, unless you get to the last round, maybe. So I'm definitely willing to take a chance there.
If we go to kicker, I mean, McManus was almost perfect last year. His only miss comes during a windy, rainy game in Green Bay against the Lions, where the wind almost literally held that ball up in the air. Does he figure highly in your kicker board, or does his age and the fact that the Packers may score more touchdowns than field goals kind of lower his ranking a little bit?
Man, NFL kickers, it seems like they've been drinking from the fountain of youth lately. So I'm not willing to rule anybody out right now because of their age at that position, like I might be at some of the other positions. Kicker is definitely a thing that I wait until the very last round of my fantasy draft to take between them and a team overall defense. I'll spend the last 2 rounds on that. But the thing that worries me about him, you're right, he was nearly perfect last year. Can he do it again this year in the elements? Because I would much rather have somebody who plays most of their games in the dome, or, hey, if you're the Denver kicker, that has worked out very well in the past because of the high altitude. So
yes,
he's on my board, but he's not my, probably top 3 choices.
And when you look at the Packers defense, I mean, there's not a lot of players necessarily that stand out other than maybe Xavier McKinney. But statistically, they were pretty good at sacks, at turnovers. Can they do it again? And how confident are you that the Packers defense would be a highly ranked fantasy defense?
Confidence is not something I've felt in a Green Bay defense in quite some time, unfortunately. It seems to be big ebbs and flows every single year. Now, I feel like I want to be more hopeful because Jeff Hafley has really proven, hey, you get me a decent assembly and guys, I can configure this thing. I can make this work. And the defensive front, so far at least, from all the training camp hype that's been coming out, they all seem much improved. The injuries are going to be the thing there. Can they all stay healthy at the same time? Safety was a concern for me, certainly when we started this offseason. I'm less and less concerned by the day with safety. I think they have so many pieces that they can move around there, and that worked pretty well last year. I got nervous because you start getting thin at cornerback, and then it's like, well, not everybody can play safety. Somebody's got to go play the boundary here, fellas. But I think that with him as a coordinator, they should be set up pretty well.
Do you have a sleeper, maybe a player that fantasy players could take a late round flyer on that's not on a lot of people's boards, but you think could be a sneaky good pickup in the last couple of rounds of the draft?
Wow, that's a good question. And we're branching out of Packers here, right? We're going through the full 32.
Yeah.
All right. I would say one name that's probably not on many folks' radar, and this is a last round pick, but it's Cedric Tillman. He's a wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. He had a little mini breakout last year. He had about 4 games that he was healthy and playing with a quarterback not named Deshaun Watson, and those 4 games were massive for him. He looked like a true stud, at least for fantasy purposes. TBD on real life NFL, but you can get him for nothing. And they're going to have to throw a lot, that team, especially with the running back that they have now having some legal issues too. So he might not even, the rookie that they drafted in the second round, might not even be playing for him this year. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Cedric Tillman.
All right. Should be interesting. And just overall, your thoughts on the Packers this season. How good can this team be, both from a football standpoint and a fantasy football standpoint?
From a fantasy standpoint, it's probably going to get a little messier than people want. You're probably going to have to fight through a lot of ups and downs. So these guys that I'm talking about, Josh Jacobs is like your anchor. That's not somebody that you should have to worry about ever. Tucker Kraft should be very good for a tight end. These wide receivers, it's going to be probably some growing pains. So don't maybe expect to start these guys in week 1, week 2 even. You might have to sort some things out before they get into your lineup on a consistent basis. For real life, I might just be saying this because I'm still thinking of the euphoria of hearing Matthew Golden's name called on night 1 at the draft live. But it really seems like the pieces that they needed to have are definitely there now. Would I like to see some other areas get bolstered? Of course. But I really think if they can figure out the offensive line, that's the tallest task in front of them. If they can figure out a core 5 that really work together, it's not going to be a one and done playoff team this year. I think it can go further.
All right, I hope so. Jake, why don't you tell our viewers where they could find your work and where they could follow you on social media?
Absolutely. You can find all my work over at fantasylife.com. Most of the content over there is free. If you want some of the more advanced content, if you've got a draft coming up, for example, we have a bunch of really helpful draft tools. If you sign up, use promo code Jake. It'll get you 20% off of that. So that's always nice. You can follow me over on Blue Sky at Jake.Trowbridge or on TikTok at Jake Trowbridge.
All right, Jake, thanks so much for doing this. Great to have you.
Thanks, Gil. I appreciate it.